Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast.
So what farming's now got to do going forward is it's got to get sexy, basically.
In this lesson, we will be focusing on the crop protection key area of the higher biology course. We will learn about some of the threats facing our crops and why it is important that we protect them. We'll look at both cultural and chemical methods of crop protection, how one farmer became the biggest producer of organic LSD in the UK, and hear how cutting-edge technology and entrepreneurship is changing farming. To help us get a better understanding of this key area, I will be joined by former Young Farmer of the Year, James Peck, and researcher and lecturer Dr. Henry Creissen from Scotland's Rural College. Throughout the lesson, we'll be referring to the SQA course specification and getting a wider appreciation of crop protection.
So I'm Dr. Henry Creissen. I'm a researcher in the crop protection team at Scotland's Rural College. I'm based at the Edinburgh campus. We have several campuses across Scotland, and most of my work is centred around improving integrated disease management strategies for cereal crops. I also do a good chunk of work looking to try to gauge levels of adoption and work with policymakers, social scientists to look at possible avenues to increase in production through sustainable integrated pest management strategies.
We've been speaking with Fiona Borthwick and Pete Ritchie in the last episode about food supply and food security, and crop protection is about protecting our food supply to a certain extent. Can you tell us a bit more about crop protection in general?
Sure. So, there's global estimates of crop losses due to pests. And when I say pests, I mean any harmful organism. So that could be a bacteria, virus, a rabbit, an insect, a slug, for example. You're looking at roughly in the region of 30 to 40% global crop losses due to pests, which is why we need to protect them. And nowadays, particularly in the more developed world, we're looking to move away from reliance on pesticides and looking at combinations of non-chemical control measures and using pesticides only when necessary. So the adage is as much as necessary, but as little as possible.
We'll hear more from Henry shortly, but in the meantime, let's meet James.
My name is James Peck. I'm Managing Director of PX Farms. We're based down in Cambridge. I started the farming business in 2003. I'm actually technically the third generation in farming, but my great-grandfather, who would be the fourth generation, bought the farm in 1950. And
that was in Scotland, James, wasn't it?
No, the farm is called Scotland Farm.
Ah.
It's in Cambridge. It's not actually in Scotland. It's actually what it is when the men who at that point that they had 60 people working on the farm. The village is a mile and a half away, and the road used to be called the High Road. So when they used to have to walk to work in the morning and back at night, they used to say it was like walking to Scotland and back. And originally the farm was called Beehive Garden, but they didn't think that was very masculine, so they changed it to Scotland Farms. That's the reason.
Did they realise if they took the low road, they'd have been there much quicker?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And they thought that all of our sheds and everything on the farm, they're all named Scottish cities.
So what sort of sheds have we got then?
Oh, we've got Fort William, Inverness.
I'm not sure Fort William's a city.
Oh, well, okay. Dundee. You're going to get very picky then.
What about Glasgow? Have we got a Glasgow shed?
We have, yes. That's our workshop.
The workhorse city of Scotland.
That's it. Yeah, that's where all the main work happens.
Absolutely.
We started off in 1950. It was a typical farm as what there would have been in those days. It was a mixed farm, so there would have been milking cows, there would have been chickens, sheep, and barley beef, and then pigs. And the arable aspect of the land, which is the fields, basically, we refer to it as arable when we grow crops in it, as opposed to grass. We were used to basically grow oats or barley or wheat to effectively feed into the livestock. So the money was actually being generated from the livestock sales, and the land was just basically assisting that. And as things changed over the coming years, and by the sort of mid-70s, when we started to get involved with Europe and whatever, and obviously the ability to bring in different produce from different countries came in, the livestock side of the business dramatically started to decrease. So at that stage, what they decided to do, and artificial fertilizer became more widespread. Now that was probably the biggest change, because after the war, they ploughed up a lot of land to basically feed the country. But when the artificial fertilizer came in, suddenly they could take land and they could double the output for the crop was producing. So the family actually got out of livestock in entirety. And by 1982, there wasn't any livestock left on the farms at all. And all the land at that stage was ploughed up, even if it was grassland, and then was used to grow crops. And in the early days, it was one side of the farm, because there were 700 acres, sort of 350 each side. It would have been wheat on one side and barley on the other, and then it rotated.
The course notes state that crop rotation, weeding and ploughing are cultural methods by which we can control weeds, other pests and diseases. Before we hear more about crop rotation from James, Henry explained to us a little bit more about weeds. My father-in-law actually recently purchased what can probably only be described as a domestic flamethrower to tackle the weeds in his driveway. I kid you not, it's quite a sight for the neighbours. They don't obviously just upset gardeners; they cause a big problem for farmers too.
Yeah, I mean, globally, weeds would probably be considered the biggest threat to production if we didn't have a whole host of non-chemical control measures to deal with them. So when you look at the gap between potential losses and actual losses, it's huge for weeds, because farmers that don't have access to herbicides and the application methods can go out. They can what we call roguing weeds. They pull them out physically by hand. Ploughing is very good at controlling some weeds, and also in other parts of the world where slash and burn is practiced, you can turn up to a new bit of land, set fire to it effectively, and that gets rid of a lot of your weed issues, at least in the for that year anyway. And that would be common practice, and particularly in parts of Africa that I've visited as well, which is always interesting when you're working on a field trial and it's nearly 40 degrees, and then someone turns up and sets the field next to you on fire. It's thanks for that.
No marshmallows, no.
But,
yeah, and these are all cultural methods of controlling weeds and pests, aren't they? So that's things like ploughing, weeding, crop rotation.
Yeah, and it's important to, with all of these, the wider sort of pests. So when you're talking about insect pests, mollusks, so slugs could be quite a problem in Scotland.
James went on to tell us more about how crop rotation is used on his farm.
What you can't really do is grow one crop year after year after year. You start to get a lot of diseases, whether it's fungicide diseases or whether it other issues with insects, etc. Or you start to get some very prominent weeds. And one of the things
why does that happen, James? Then, if you don't rotate, why do you start to get these build up of disease?
You get a level of resistance, and that's some of the issues. And what we're seeing now with some of the chemicals we have and things, that you start using the same thing continuously, and we're seeing it with antibiotics in animals, etc. But actually, just using the same products time after time, the plants, nature adjusts basically. And effectively, nature then decides to ignore what it is you're putting on and creates a resistance. And I suspect that's probably one of the biggest problems going forward that modern agriculture is going to have to deal with, because we have had a massive reduction in our armory of chemicals. That's where you start to get a greater form of resistance because you're using less, more, basically. And it doesn't matter whether it's chemically based or whether it's crop based. If you look at rotation and whatever on Google, you'll probably find eventually that it came about by the chap that owned Holcombe Hall over in Norfolk. I think they used to refer to him as Turnip Cook. And he basically came up with the rotation and found that the land in itself, if you put different crops in each year in the same field, the land responds very well. And just as an example, if you grow a legume like beans in a field and then you follow it by wheat crop, the wheat crop might see a 20% increase in yield because it followed the beans. So beans, as an example, don't need nitrogen, so they are nitrogen fixing. That's one of the things I hope in my living career, that they actually manage to genetically modify plants, which of course is a subject some people don't like, to actually not have to mine the ground to get nitrogen out of it or phosphates, because the plants actually can get what they need out of the atmosphere. If say you grew winter wheat and you decided to put it in every year, when you get to about year 4 up to 7, it's dropped dramatically, probably even 50%. After year 7, it starts to climb again, but it will probably only do at best 80%. But the issue then is, which is fine, some people back in the day used to grow continuous wheat, but the issue was that you got some weeds, whether they're wild oats or whether they were black grass or other plants, then you had no control over. So, of course, eventually those population numbers grow dramatically to the point that you can no longer control it, and you probably then aren't able to grow the wheat anymore because the land at that stage is riddled. And you get other soil-borne diseases. So if you grew, say, for example, turnips or sugar beet or something of that order every year, or potatoes, the land eventually becomes sick, and you can no longer grow those crops. They die. Or they get wireworm or other issues in the soil that become the populations of those explode, earworm, and prevent you from growing those crops. And that is mainly due to rotation, and that's what people have found over the last 100 years, I suppose. That rotation is everything, and that's the skill.
Well, the definition of a weed is really a plant in the wrong place. For us, if we've got a field of wheat and there's some barley growing in it, then that barley is the weed. We call it a volunteer. There are traits that a lot of weeds have, and you mentioned some of them. They're able to colonize ground quickly and produce a lot of seed very quickly. But there are various different types of weeds. Some of them cannot be effectively controlled through ploughing, for example. So some weeds that have rhizomes or stolons, so up here, I called it couch grass from back home, but it's ranch, I think it's pronounced. I think it's a common name for it up here. This is the problem with weeds. It's usually how farmers would refer to the weed. But I was speaking to somebody recently, and he said there was, I think, about 40 different common names in the UK for this weed.
Wow.
Sticky Willy being one of them.
Sticky Willy, everybody will have heard of. Yeah. They will come across Sticky Willies if they've gone for a walk in the countryside. And in fact, that actually brings me to an interesting story about a Swiss hiker who, I think it was back in early 1940s, 1941, something like that, went out for a walk in the Alps in Switzerland. And he had burrs all over his clothes, which I think would maybe be a sort of similar idea. And these burrs were all over his clothes and his dog, and he decided to, when he got home, to look at them under a microscope, as you do. And he saw they were covered in tiny little hooks, and he actually went on to develop Velcro, which was a pretty opportunistic thing to do after his walk, I guess. Would that be a sort of similar thing to Sticky Willy?
Yeah, I mean, you have to think about the dispersal method. So those weeds that are looking to disperse by animals would be looking to develop something like your Velcro, or birds would be a large, big distributor of seeds, because they come, eat the fruit, fly away, and then the seed comes out the other end and can potentially grow from there. So there are various different ways of weed dispersal. Some of them disperse by the wind, going to vary in success according to where you are. I mean, some of them disperse by seed. I mean, by water. So some of the problems we have with weeds along riverbanks in the UK is because the seed is dispersed through the water.
Within the higher course, we need to know the difference between the properties of annual weeds and perennial weeds. Annual weeds tend to have a short life cycle of around 1 year, with rapid growth and high numbers of seeds produced. Perennial weeds, such as the couch grass mentioned by Henry earlier on, tend to have longer life cycles of 2 or more years and are capable of vegetative reproduction. They tend to have storage organs which allow them to survive through the autumn and winter, and generally store energy in the form of a carbohydrate. This seems like a good opportunity to get back to one of my favourite subjects: beans and potatoes. On the last episode with Pete Ritchie, it was quite an in-depth discussion about potatoes and our favourite baked potato toppings. What would yours be?
Beans and cheese, me. I'm pretty classic.
Cheesy beano.
Yeah.
That's my own heart. And do you have your baked beans hot or cold?
Hot. Have it.
Hot.
Yeah. So it melts the cheese.
Yeah. Pete had suggested in the last lesson that he prefers his beans cold, which was a bold statement.
Oh. Controversial, lad.
Yeah, I think we might actually move this podcast away from higher biology altogether and just talk about beans and potatoes. But at the SRUC, obviously a lot of work goes on to do with potato cysts and potato cyst nematodes, and looking at how crop rotation can impact the incidence and viability of those potato cysts.
Well, potato cyst nematodes are a particular problem in Scotland because the potato industry, I think last estimates I saw, roughly about half the profitability from the Scottish potato industry, it comes from growing seed potatoes.
And what do we mean by seed potato?
These are basically really small potatoes that are used as the seed for a crop, and a lot of those are sent to places like North Africa, for example. So I think the Egyptians actually buy quite a lot of seed potato from the Scots. And the reason that the Scottish produce such good quality seed potatoes is predominantly because it's not a particularly favourable environment for aphids.
And what is an aphid?
So aphids are small sap-sucking insects that they are capable of transmitting a lot of viruses, and we need to get the most for your seed potato crop. You need to be basically virus-free, certified virus-free, because every time you grow that potato, the viral titer, the viral levels, are going to increase and sometimes basically double. So that reduces the effective sort of lifespan of that potato crop. So you want virus-free, and a lot of the crops that we're actually growing here will be basically virus-free. So I worked in Ireland, and they do a lot of potato breeding there. But you end up in quite a strange situation that it's bred in the southeast of Ireland where I was working. The seeds are brought to Scotland to be grown, and then they're brought back by the Irish.
Or the Irish are known for enjoying our potatoes as much as the rest of us. They obviously get their seed potatoes from us.
A lot of them, yeah, because if you're growing Ireland's a bit further south than Scotland, and if you're growing near the coast, for example, you're probably more likely to have issues with aphids on years that aphids are going to be a problem. So you wouldn't be able to grow a cost-effective seed potato there because there's a good chance you're going to get some of these viruses that are spread by aphids. So if you're looking for bringing a new variety, there's a good chance the seed would have been multiplied up in Scotland and then brought back to Ireland. At the moment, the potato industry in Ireland is kind of dominated by one or two varieties. So when I was there a few years ago, there was a variety called Rooster, which was about sort of 60% of the ware market, as we say. And the ware potatoes would be the ones you see in supermarket shelves. And that creates other problems as well, because particularly for potatoes, we need to use quite substantial amounts of fungicides to control a disease called late blight. And this is not actually a fungus, it's a neomycete that was basically responsible for the Irish potato famine, along with the English. You can edit that bit.
That's of course coming from an Englishman, so...
And my mum's Scottish, so I'm sort of I'm actually Irish as well, so...
That's a strong mixture as well.
Yeah. When talking about late blight, the vast amount of fungicides used to control blight, which is caused by Phytophthora infestans. And it can basically turn up in a crop and you'll see small amounts. And if you don't notice it and don't deal with it, within a few weeks, you can lose the entire crop if you weren't to spray. So farmers urge on the side of caution.
Course, and it was the Phytophthora infestans that caused the Great Famine in Ireland, which obviously began back in, I think it was 1845, and that spread so quickly. I believe it kind of ruined up to half the potato crop that year alone, and then up to 3/4 for the next several years, and probably caused the death of roughly 1 million Irish people from starvation and related causes. What's been done since then to really get over that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it can spread very quickly throughout the field. Once it's noticeable within the crop, within a couple of weeks, the whole crop could be totally devastated. The issue with this and a lot of other potato diseases, I mentioned the viruses earlier, is that it can carry over into the following crop. So if you save some of the smaller potatoes to use as the seed for the next crop, they're still going to have high levels of disease in, which is why you saw you might have had a bad crop, you save the seed, and then the next year is a horrendous crop because you're implanting already infected seeds. And this is a problem throughout crop production globally. Sourcing healthy seeds is key. It's basically the cornerstone, along with suitable varieties. So one of your first choices after you've selected the land and cultivating that is going to have a massive impact potentially on your yield and potentially quality at the end of the season as well.
Let's go back to James, who can tell us a wee bit more about producing potatoes from a farming point of view.
Now, we're only in our second year, and this is our first year of growing them in our own right. Last year, we were in a different venture. So we're now growing for kettle chips. So the Norfolk-based business, as I'm sure most of you are familiar, when you're watching your Netflix,
I do like a bag of kettle chips. I have to say, been talking a lot in this lesson and the last lesson about potatoes and our favourite fillings for a baked potato. What is your favourite filling for a baked potato, James?
Cool. What would I have? I think I'd go with something pretty standard, actually. But I'd probably try and sneak a bit of cheese in there, but I'd probably get told off by my wife because she says that now I'm getting a bit older, I'm getting a bit heavier. She's not the man I was. So, yeah.
I don't think there's anything wrong with putting a bit of cheese. What about some beans? We've been talking about some beans too. Would you put beans on there?
Yes, definitely, yeah.
Now, tell us this. Do you prefer hot baked beans or cold baked beans? We've already had one farmer on our lessons who's told us that he prefers his baked beans cold.
Well, to be honest, I don't really care. It is not unfamiliar for me to open the tin now they've got the ring pull top on them and just start chucking into them when I'm in a hurry. And I'm not worried whether they're hot or cold. To be perfect,
this isn't obviously a very scientific way of finding things out, but that's 100% of farmers so far have said they like their baked beans cold, which is quite an interesting
fact. How funny.
Tell us a bit more about the kettle chip thing, because we got sort of off track talking about baked beans and baked potatoes. How does that process work then?
So we've ended up getting a contract with Kettle, who probably just over an hour from where we live. So transport, we run 12 lorries, so the ability for us to take potatoes from the field straight to the factory, as we're going to do, is a relatively simple concept for us. And so we're growing two varieties, which are Marquise, which is quite a traditional, well-known name, and then another one called Heliclear. And the Heliclear will be harvested last. The Marquise will be done first, and then we're going to take them straight into the site at Kettle, and they'll be going straight down the production line, straight into bags. Now, interestingly, through the coronavirus, there's been a huge upset in the potato industry because, of course, McDonald's and Burger King and all the fish chip shops and everything like that closed. So there's been stores and stores all over Europe who have suddenly ground to a halt, and they've got potatoes which they're having to now dump because, of course, they've got a sort of a shelf life. And that's decimated incomes on the potato side. Now, fortunately, I've signed up with a snack food provider, if that's the right term. And actually, while people have been, in their households and watching Netflix and whatever, the kettle chip snack food is actually doing really well because people enjoy that, don't they? Sitting on the sofa.
Absolutely. And have you got a favourite flavour?
Oh, well, there was. I quite like I think probably the one I like the most is the smoky bacon type one.
Nice. That's
I
good
quite
flavour.
like.
And what are you watching on Netflix with your smoky bacon?
Oh, I'm quite a big fan of Netflix, actually.
What are you watching this now? What do you recommend to us?
Well, I've just finished watching the series for The Kingdom of Wessex, which is probably for old duffers like me, not for young hipsters. But I quite enjoyed that.
I've not seen that one.
You haven't?
Not sure that, no, but I'm not sure that makes me a young hipster, I have to say. While James was finishing his smoky bacon crisps, Henry was keen to share with us some of the threats facing potato farming in Scotland.
Colleagues of mine work on potato-cyst nematode, and we talked about that earlier. This is becoming an increasing threat to the Scottish potato growing industry because these cysts can survive for many, many years in the soil. 15, 20 years sometimes. So actually, the more traditional non-chemical control of measures, such as rotation of crops, are much less effective. And this is a problem because we have to show that the land is certified free from a potato-cyst nematode if we want to use that land to grow a seed potato crop. So this is becoming, we're basically seeing a reduction in the amount of potato growing land that's PCN free year on year, which is an issue. So we are having more varieties coming through that can confer some resistance, or what can be considered perhaps more tolerance to the two different species that we have issues with, but it's still a major concern for those in the seed growing sector.
There are clearly major concerns facing farmers trying to protect their crops, and I went on to ask Henry about what other threats our crops face and whether we might see another tragedy such as that caused in the 1800s.
We do see the catastrophic disasters related to monoculture production, and we've seen them fairly recently as well. Even within Europe, you can have a bad year for disease such as yellow rust, which will completely total a lot of winter wheat fields. This is because we were relying on what we call major gene resistance a bit more back in the day. So that resistance is fairly easy to overcome by a pathogen that has multiple reproduction cycles in the same season. So polycyclic, we call it. It's able to rapidly have a lot of sex and evolve to overcome the variety's inherent resistance. We've learned from that, and now the breeders tend to adopt more of a strategy for durable disease resistance, where you have lots of minor genes or quantitative trait loci that all combine to have a good effect, which means that it's a lot more difficult for the pathogen to evolve and overcome those resistance genes. But if you look at the moment, the issues that locusts have caused in Africa, now moving up into India as well, that can have massive knock-on effects when you have these swarms of locusts passing overhead for hours and just completely devastating whole regions. And the Indians are very concerned about that at the moment. There are also another pest that would be, as I say, like sort of knocking on the door, fall armyworm, which was identified, I believe, in the States. That's why it's called fall armyworm. It must have been seen more in the autumn. And it's spreading throughout Asia and Africa at the moment, targeting some of the major food crops there, such as maize, which would be a massive crop for sub-Saharan Africa as well. These are hitting those producers that are perhaps much smaller scale, smallholders, subsistence farmers. They don't have any insurance or any sort of alternative income sources. So the actual impact of that particular pest can have huge impacts on the community.
These are obviously major global battles, if you will, in terms of protecting our food crops, but it's not something we tend to see a lot of, on the news or in the newspapers.
Yeah, I think something you might have seen a little bit more on recently in the news is the bacteria Xylella fastidiosa. So this has caused massive losses of olive trees in Italy and Spain, and and it's sort of moving further north as its range is sort of expanding. It's bred by, I think, a few different insect vectors, frog hoppers being one of them, and spittlebugs. I think they'll. So if you might have seen last year, I noticed it a lot on particularly on lavender in the garden. There was a lots of this sort of, it looked like bits basically on the leaves. That is a sign of spittlebug activity, and that is potential vector for Xylella. It's not here on our shores at the moment, but it's causing massive crop losses in southern Europe. And as I said, the range is slowly moving northwards.
What's been done to solve that problem?
I mean, this really requires sort of a lot of communication at the national and global level as well to try to what we call horizon scan. And this is a big part of what myself and colleagues would do. So you'd be looking countries with similar sort of environments, and you'd be having a look to see if the issues they're experiencing can potentially be a problem for the UK. So even when we're talking about diseases, we do it year on year. We look to see what problems the Irish and the English are having.
It's not like the Irish and English that have problems.
But we look to them first. We look down south and say, okay, they're having a lot of issues with this particular disease this year. It may be a problem for us because usually we're a couple of weeks behind them because the crops are growing slower because it's cold up here. So we can have a look to see what is going on in those crops and make sort of predictions as to what we do here. We are at advantage in terms of looking at control of invasive species and quarantine pests because we're on an island. So there are some measures that can be put in place to try to prevent the import of timber or plant materials that may be carrying unwanted pests and diseases and invasive pests and diseases. So this is when it comes down to sustainable and safe sourcing of growing materials, but also products as well. As I said, with the potato seed sector, but also cereals and other crops as well, just safe seed is crucial to prevent new diseases coming in, but also prevent issues due to endemic diseases. So particularly at the moment when we're talking about Xylella, because it infects several hundred different plant species that can act as the host, there are some issues that could be related to the sourcing of, say, olive trees and things like that from garden centres. Unless they've got a plant passport, unless we can track where it's been, we don't know where it's come from. It could hold all kinds of pests and diseases that could potentially be an issue for the UK because the climate would allow that pest or disease to become an issue. So actually, it's a lot harder to deal with now because it's very easy if you want to order a plant online. It can come from Europe. You don't exactly know where it's come from. It turns up at your door a few days later. It's very easy for the grower. But unless you know where it's come from, you could potentially be unleashing hell on not just your garden, but even nationally.
One of the risks of a biological control is that the control organism may become an invasive species, which, as Henry says, can unleash hell on an ecosystem. Weeds and other pests and diseases can be controlled by biological control and integrated pest management. In biological control, the control agent is a natural predator, parasite or pathogen of the pest, while integrated pest management is a combination of chemical, biological and cultural control.
It's certainly used more in the protected growing environments of glass houses and polytunnels where you can release these biocontrols. There may be predators, parasitoids in a confined environment, and they're very effective in those situations. When it comes to a field setting, what we have to do is try to create a habitat that's suitable for those beneficial pests. So you be planting margins around the fields that contain plant species that provide habitat and food sources to attract these pests and these predators and parasitoids in. When they're there, they can also feed on the pests that would normally be troubling the crops. Globally, it's been used to control weeds, for example. I was made aware of a study in Australia done a few years ago that they found a rust species, a fungus, that was able to kill or at least damage a weed that they had a massive problem with. I forget the name of it now. This was interesting because there's very few examples of fungi being used as biological control.
Certainly within the classroom, we tend to talk about more kind of classical examples of ladybirds being used within greenhouses, etc. So the idea that obviously that can then be used by a kind of fungus to control a plant species is quite remarkable.
Yeah, so for that you need to have a fungus that's very specific, because you don't want to release a lot of this fungal pathogen into the environment only to find that it's also able to infect some of the major crops.
Cultural and biological control of pests is not straightforward, and we also find that there are both advantages and disadvantages to using pesticides to protect crops. Henry explained the difference between selective and systemic pesticides.
You've got selective pesticides in general versus the broad spectrum. The selective will have a narrow range in terms of the species that they're going to be effective on, whereas the opposite for broad spectrum. When you're talking about systemic, correct, it's moving through the vascular system, but there are other types of pesticides, such as contact pesticides. So a lot of the fungicides that might be used early on in the growing season have to land on the leaf, basically on the fungus they're trying to control to be effective. Whereas the systemic fungicides and insecticides can be basically absorbed by the plant and can actually be moved around through the vascular tissues for sometimes a couple of weeks. So they offer more curative approaches as well as preventing just those that would be attacking the plant at that time in the field. I mean, there are some herbicides as well, which we would call amphimobile, such as glyphosate, that is able to not only move throughout the above ground plant material, but able to get into the roots as well and kill the entire plant. So we really have contact, which is when you basically need to hit it to get the control. Translaminar, which is basically it moves within the leaf a bit. Systemic, where it can move through the vascular tissues. It might not move throughout the entire plant, but still. And then the amphimobile, which is through the entire plant.
James went on to explain some of the challenges he faces as a farmer trying to protect his crops using pesticides.
We bought a brand new sprayer which came last week. Now that sprayer, just as an example, that cost us about $284,000. Now the technology on that sprayer that makes that important for the environment and for the efficiency is effectively, if you fill up that tank, you might have £4,000 or £5,000 worth of chemical in it at any one fill. And you could be doing 4 fills a day, just to put it into perspective. So if you're spending that level of money, you need to have something which is absolutely bang on in many different ways, getting the chemical where it needs to be and maximizing the time in which you can apply. So for example, this morning there was a frost, so you don't want to be spraying chemicals in a frost or when a frost comes out.
Why would you not want to do that?
Well, because if the leaf is frozen or whatever, and you spray on it, then the spray hits the frost and rolls straight onto the ground, completely wasted. You need the chemical to get absorbed into the plant, so you need to have a dry leaf. Effectively, you do not want to have a lot of wind. You want to have a fairly nice still day. You want the boom above the crop, 50 centimeters, and you want it to be at the right pressures. 3 bar is the target pressure. And you want that driving the mist of the chemical into the canopy. And you want that then to set and dry into the leaf. The leaf will absorb it, then that's giving it the fungicides or whatever. If you've got insects in there, also that just like running around with a fly spray, you go target it at the insect so it kills it. So effectively you want the same. Now what you don't want to do is you don't want to spray bombing through the countryside and a vortex of chemical coming out the back, which is then being evaporated into the atmosphere. You need it to go into the crop. So to do that, the couple of things you want is the wider the booms go, the more the booms have the ability to move around. So the more they move around, you either got the one end of the boom hitting the floor, which is applying to the floor, not to the crop, and the other end too high up that's then been evaporated or blown somewhere else. So what you need to do is you need to maintain a perfect height, like an aeroplane, straight across the field. So the boom we use, the sprayer, is made by Horsch, and now he's got these sensors on it. Now the really interesting about the Horsch sprayer is that the guy that builds them used to be a chief designer for Audi cars. So he came out of a different industry. He wasn't a farmer, came into farming and brought his technology and his thinking into it, and then started building sprayers. So effectively, the technology on these booms is now they can move in many different movements, a bit like your leg. Your leg and your ankle can move at different angles. So the booms are like that. So if you've got undulating ground or slopes or whatever, the boom can then adjust according to the slope of the ground, which will then maintain the height of the boom across the top of the crop. Now, the nozzles are designed. Now, the nozzles are the part that basically the chemical is blown out of. You have different nozzles for different jobs and for different conditions. So we use low drift nozzles, for example, and you set them so that they run perfectly at 50 centimetres. And then the boom is, of course, staying at 50 centimetres. So you're giving that the best opportunity to get that chemical into that canopy or that crop. Now, the beauty of these sensors is as your crop grows, the boom moves up. So you as an operator are not having to get out there and measure 50 centimetres. The sensors know what 50 centimetres are. And as the crop goes, so if you've got a higher crop at one end of the field to the other, that boom will adjust according to where it is in the field. So because not sometimes, for whatever reason, crops are not always the same at one end to the other. So that in itself creates efficiencies. Secondly, we've got technology on these booms now that if we tell it to stop within 5 centimetres of when that nozzle crosses over where the previous nozzle has run before, it will turn that bank of nozzles off. So now, effectively, we have created a 3% greater efficiency through technology than what a human eye can do. Now, 3% doesn't sound like a lot, but of course in farming, everything is of very small percentages of lift. 3% of chemical saving, if you've got a bit, just to put it into perspective, I've got, say, £1 million chemical bill, and I've had a 3% saving. That is some saving of £30,000. That's not to be sniffed at.
I was interested to find out more about how technology was influencing life in James's farm.
Agriculture, effectively, is at this point in time, is going through quite a change. And what's happening is that we're now embracing technology in not just in the simple sense of computers and phones and whatever. I travelled the world, part of a Nuffield scholarship, and I looked at controlled traffic farming. Now, controlled traffic farming, just within, in a quick understanding of what that is, all the tractors are steered by satellites, basically. Every time a tractor goes in the field, they're all driving exactly the same place. Doesn't matter what tractor it is, which operator it is, what year, what day, they all drive in exactly the same position. Now, the idea of that was that we would move forward an 18% yield increase just from adapting where we drove, because of course you compact land, the roots can't grow, the crops can't grow, etc. You get poor crops. Now, precision planting, we're able to plant and put a seed down exactly 5 centimetres away from the previous one, for example, and when it crosses over from where we've been before, it turns off. So you've got 24 units, for example, across 12 metres if you're drilling, say, sugar beet, and it's that precise now, all based on satellites and RTK.
And it all sounds quite complicated. What's it like to operate one of these vehicles? It sounds as if it's more like playing a computer game than possibly driving what many people would consider to be a tractor.
Yeah, if somebody got in a modern tractor now, I think they'd be shocked. They're not anything as they were before. You drive them on a stick, just like a console on an Xbox. So you push the lever forward, the faster you push it forward, the faster it goes, you put it back. You can hit it to the right, and that will auto-select the speed that you've already told it you want to go at, and it will go to that. You hit it again to slow down or speed up for a headland when you turn. That's all preset. You can press a button now, and it will automatically do the speed. It will automatically lift up the implements and things on spool valves behind. You've got cameras in there looking at, like on the potato planter, he's got 8 cameras looking at everything that's going on, from the potatoes going down the spout, etc. The man is turning currently. We're waiting for the government to allow us to have the technology for the tractor will actually turn itself. Now, that is the first stage to robotics, because robotics need to have the pre-programmed ability to go up and down a field, round the field, and turn at the end. And once they allow that, then robotics, I think, will take off in farming dramatically. And the guys operating those, will be a completely different person to the people that we have today.
James went on to explain a bit more about this need for a different kind of farmer.
Mostly farming, and it probably came about before the wars, were effectively our family-based businesses. But actually, the world's moving on. You need either greater scale or you need specialism. So if the businesses have stood still or haven't created scale, and their succession plan is the children have gone to work elsewhere in London or wherever, they're not going to come back to farming and want to work 7 days a week and a lot of hours and very small pay, because why would they? And no parent's going to ask their child, I don't think, to go to that life, and that's progression. So what farming's now got to do going forward is it's got to get sexy, basically. It's got to start having non-farming families, non-farming people coming out of their other lives and wanting to come into farming. The model of farming children coming in is dead. But what we've got to do is we need new, fresh expertise, new, fresh thinking out of the farming industry coming in. And we need to get back to the point where we start asking the question why, because the best way to change anything is being challenged on why we're doing something that we do every year and have done for generations. Now, technology is starting to play a massive part in that, and that is what's exciting about my particular business. I like large-scale farming. I like producing big yields. That to me is important, and it's safe food for everybody that I want to eat, I want my children eating, etc. But I also need to make sure that this industry is exciting and we can start getting some fresh blood in. Farming is no longer dog and stick, leaning over the gate, chewing a bit of straw. That's gone. Those days are over. Big high-tech businesses are getting involved in farming. They're investing in farming. They're going into technology. They're looking at GM and all those things, and manipulating seeds and things and plants to be less reliant on chemicals and to try and get rid of resistant issues, etc. And to as we talked about earlier with the rotations and the plant weeds and things, and starting to move forward where we don't have a monoculture of just blanket fields of maize and things, which I don't think is any good for anybody, but actually creating this diverse culture.
James went on to explain further about how they've invested in technology to further improve the efficiency of their farm.
We built a grain hospital, and basically we were growing crops like barley, for example, which got ergot. Now, ergot, interestingly, is a deformed grain. It's like a fungus that grows on the grain and it goes black. And when they were burning witches on the stake, it turned out that the wheat that they were milling up and putting into bread had ergot in it, when it's effectively ergot is an LSD. So people were going crazy. And so they were just eating innocent bread and going crazy. And then they were burning the women on the stakes because they thought they were witches. I built this grain hospital, which is using technology from Denmark, which basically, as the grain goes over it, the cameras on it are looking at the grain as it passes down the tubes. And it uses air to blow the individual ergot seeds out of the wheat and rejects them into a hopper below. And effectively, that meant that then wheat was able to be used for human consumption because we'd taken out all of the ergot. Anyway, so somebody told me that I was effectively this ergot was worth a fortune, and these companies would buy it and they were going to use it in the pharmaceutical industry and for whatever they were doing. So I started bagging up this stuff, and I must have had at one point about 27 tons of it, which is 27 big bags, which is huge. So until somebody once pointed out to me, effectively, I must be the largest supplier of organic drugs in the country. I got so nervous about it, but I had it all incinerated.
It was either burning the goods or burning yourself at the stake.
Well, that's it. Effectively, I didn't want the legacy of my family thinking that I was selling the students in Cambridge organic LSD.
The point James was making, of course, is that this grain hospital allows crops to be sold where previously they might have been rejected. This drive to increase yield and think differently continues to be vital in crop production. Thanks to both James and Henry for their input, and we'll hear from them again in future lessons. Finally, just to say a big thank you to Lecky Scotland and Education Scotland, who have offered their support to allow me to continue to deliver these podcast-style lessons for each key area of the higher course during these unprecedented times and beyond. If you're using the Lecky Scotland Higher Biology for SQA 2019 and beyond, Revision and Practice 2 books in 1, then you'll find the crop protection section on pages 68 to 71. And you can get 40% off all Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers using the discount code LeckyPodcast40 online at www.leckyscotland.co.uk.